Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Teacher's Classroom podcast. My name is Matt Weld, and I am your host here on Teach Illinois. At the recording of this podcast, it is coming up on Thanksgiving, and it's a time when we set food out for the Scouting Food Drive and make donations to our local food pantries and, have food drives at school and that kind of thing. And we really have those who are less fortunate at the front of our minds. As teachers, however, we need to have a mindset that everyone should have hope for the future, and we need to support everyone regardless of their background. And so today, my guest is Dr. Eric Jensen, and we will be talking about poverty. Eric Jensen is a former teacher who grew up in San Diego, California. With a Ph.D. in human development, he synthesizes brain research and develops practical applications for educators. He is listed among the top 30 educators in the world at globalgurus.org. Dr. Jensen co-founded an academic enrichment program held in 21 countries with over 85,000 graduates to help answer two questions. First, is it possible to turn struggling students around in just days or weeks? And second, if it is possible, what insights and strategies can help us do that in schools? He has written over 30 books, including Teaching with Poverty in Mind and Poor Students, Rich Teaching. Today, you'll gain some insights on how you can turn struggling students around and help them graduate career and college ready. Welcome, Dr. Jensen. How are you?
I'm all good. Thank you for having me.
I'm really honored to have you on the show this morning. And I think all our listeners, I just have to tell you a quick story. I told my wife, she's also an educator, an assistant superintendent, that I was going to be interviewing you today. And she had a little bit of a fangirl moment. I'm not going to lie. She was all excited. She says, "Oh my gosh, I've read so many of his books and used them in my curriculum, blah, blah, blah." So,
well, yeah, thank you. It's good to know there are fans.
The fan base. Yeah. Well, I mean, 21 countries, 85,000 graduates, that's pretty impressive.
Well, just one student at a time is my attitude. Just keep going forward.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's every teacher's attitude, right? One kid at a time, for sure. And in the books that you've written, specifically the one that I've been reading recently, which is Teaching with Poverty in Mind, you definitely have that students first mentality. And I appreciate that it's all research based. Being a science major myself, I love all the graphs and the citations and that kind of thing. So, but diving right into this topic of poverty and teaching with poverty in mind, there's been a lot of focus recently, at least here in Illinois, especially on trauma. And I feel that poverty is one type of trauma. Is that accurate?
I think that the way to think about poverty and why I sort of broke it down in my book is that many people have stereotypes about it, especially those that don't have much history with it. So a stereotype for them is that kids dress a certain way, they talk a certain way, their attitude is a certain way. And I think one of the things that I've tried to do is to broaden people's way of thinking about poverty. So you could be upper class and have trauma, middle class and have trauma, or poor and have trauma. So when I think about the different types of poverty, some of the more classic ones are things like urban poverty, rural poverty, or suburban poverty. And by the way, most of you would know by now that we have more suburban and rural poverty than we do urban poverty in our country. You could also think of poverty not just by geography, but think of it on a timeline. For example, is it situational? did something just happen, like a weather disaster, such as a hurricane or earthquakes or a flood, tornadoes that can put people almost instantly into poverty. It could be generational, like that it's been in the family for just generations and they haven't been able to pull the pieces together to escape that. And many times when I'm driving around the country going to schools and visiting them, I'm driving through suburban and rural areas, and I see a lot of working class poverty where they have jobs and they're still living paycheck to paycheck. And they couldn't write a check for $300. Like that's just completely out of bounds for them. And of course, we see a lot of poverty from immigrants coming to our country. So there's a lot of different ways to try to break down the types of poverty. And certainly, the worst type would be what we'd call absolute poverty, which is daily food scarcity. So for anyone just trying to wrap your head around poverty, I think one frame that I use for it now is poverty is typically about, have you had experiences that have created a lot of adversity to you? And for most middle class people or upper class, you can survive just fine a bad thing, like a bad car accident or losing your job or maybe getting evicted. But once you start piling up those adverse childhood experiences, more of them put you at greater risk for becoming poor. It's just that the rich have a greater firewall around their lives, or a greater moat, if you want to call it, protective way to prevent the bottom from falling out, meaning insurance policies, money in the family, or a backup plan, or better health to begin with. Like, you start naming all of these things that allow them to be able to have adversity, and yet they can still go forward. Whereas if you're living on the edge, one bad thing can tip you over. So the way that I talk about poverty in most of my courses today is that if you've had a couple of bad things, one or two, then it's not that big of a deal. But once you start piling those up, then your likelihood of being in poverty is pretty high. So I don't know if there is a way to define poverty, except that you're more likely to see an aggregate of risk factors. And a risk factor could be you lose your job, you've got cancer, there's a divorce, someone in the family went to prison, you get evicted, you have a chronic disease or illness, you live in an unsafe neighborhood. So one factor usually isn't a deal breaker, but multiple factors can be pretty nasty.
And so it sounds like a lot of those factors that you're talking about are on the ACEs scale. How much of a factor does money actually play? I guess I always thought of poverty as strictly monetary, but that doesn't sound accurate.
Right. You can have people, like just as an example would be there's myths about people who are poor, and a myth is that poor people are more likely to use drugs, but they're not. Actually, the greatest socioeconomic class of drug users is upper class people, or that the poor are more lazy, when in fact the reality is that they work on average the same number of hours per week as middle class do. They just work at jobs that don't pay diddly squat. So it's actually a real messy. It's a messy matrix if you want to sort of divide things out or categorize things and say, well, the rich do this or the poor do that. Having more money creates some insulation from bad things in life, but it doesn't keep you from being careless, stupid, reckless. It doesn't prevent you from getting in a car accident. It doesn't prevent you from becoming an alcoholic. So one way to think about poverty is that it's a chronic condition, which means it sticks around for a while. And it really is something that is an aggregate of risk factors that are a bit overwhelming. And I say that because you and I could have a bad thing happen to us and we're going to get up the next morning and charge ahead. But you just start piling them up. And that's what you usually see with people who are poor.
And then that has an effect on their brains, right?
Yes. And nobody really pieced this puzzle together until the two lead researchers who actually designed the ACE study, which ACE is Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, a little over 20 years ago. Dr. Felitti, who was the person in San Diego at the Kaiser Permanente Center, they had a database of over 17,000 adults at the time. So they knew the health history of 17,000 adults. He was visiting the CDC in Atlanta and hooked up with Dr. Anda, A-N-D-A, and those two started talking, and they say, hey, we need to share some research because Anda could tell you completely different things that were going on. And so when they put together the ACE survey, which asked questions like, before the age of 16, did you experience this, such as emotional abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse or neglect, or was someone in your family imprisoned and things like that. When they collected all that data, the researchers were absolutely stunned at the proportion of the population that had experienced ACEs. And that started getting them to create a timeline in which, because they had the adult health records, they could say, wow, there's a correlation with bad things that happen when you're young, that change the brain while you're young, that are more likely to show up as adverse school behaviors and health risks, which are more likely to lead to risky adoption of risky behaviors, which are more likely to lead to chronic illnesses or disease or legal issues, which are more likely to lead to early death or disease. In other words, at that time when they put this together, they suddenly saw adverse childhood experiences as this is an enormous social, economic matrix about the risks that we have in our population, because now it involves healthcare, it involves public policy, and they'd never thought about it that way before.
Yeah, and so as schools are looking into this public policy of healthcare and really examining kids for who they are and understanding that they come from various backgrounds, in your book somewhere, you mentioned how teachers have control over 28% of a student's day, right? And so schools have to be very intentional about how they both structure their schools and their classrooms to support students who come from poverty.
Yes, and I think that's asking a lot of teachers, and yet that's what's required, meaning who we become is partly how do we spend our waking and sleeping hours. For example, just getting a good night's sleep is restorative for your brain in many ways to help keep you healthier. It literally can wash out some of the toxins and the debris during the night. It can help you form better memories and obviously rest and heal your body. During the daytime, the more minutes that you or I spend doing anything and feeling a certain way, the more that starts feeling home to us, like natural, like normal. Like if you are angry all day, every day, then being angry is so normal to you that if you act angry around someone else and they say, hey, quit being so angry, that's actually insulting to them. That's like saying, don't be you. Whereas when teachers foster positivity in a classroom, and they foster hope, and they foster gratitude, and they foster kindness, and they foster forgiveness, those are emotional traits that for some people are manifesting in a period of seconds out of a day, and for others, 0 seconds. But the more minutes per day that you experience kindness, the more kindness becomes you, because your brain wires itself around what you do the most to help you be that way. So part of the intentionality that you just mentioned with teachers is that you can't be real sloppy and be a Title I school teacher that's successful with kids. If in front of your own kids, you act out, you get angry, you accuse kids of things, you want to penalize them for being 2 minutes late for class, like unless you're spot on every day, kids don't see the adult role model they need, and they spend part of their day with you. That's those golden moments. They spend part of that time feeling like I'm less than, or maybe I'm oppressed, or I'm not valued, or I'm not important. And that just feeds into what they might be bringing from a neighborhood, or maybe from their peers, or even from home. In other words, teachers do have to be more intentional if you want to succeed. And that's asking a lot, but that's what's needed.
Yeah, that is asking a lot. And just to be authentic, do you think some of this needs to be addressed in teacher training programs?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that what we're asking teachers to do today is so different than it was when you or I were going to school. And that's way different from, a couple generations ago. And I think that tells you where the breakdowns are. In other words, breakdowns are that to succeed with students today requires us recruiting differently, getting different people into the system, creating a better system that supports them, fostering more illuminated trainings for them, and greater support for teachers in schools that function better so that the environment's better for teachers. I mean, you could go through a long list, both from micro all the way out to macro, even including up to public policy, which would include things like, in my opinion, if I could wave a wand, I'd double the salary of 90% of the teachers in the United States, and 10% of them, I'd help them find another job. So in other words, you could go at this so many different ways, but you're right. It asks a lot of teachers.
I think it seems like we need the personality of the teachers to be definitely more like what we expect of doctors, I think, perhaps as being helpers, compassionate, empathetic people.
Yes, I think that's not an easy thing to ask for. When I first started teaching, I actually didn't have very good social emotional skills. I literally had to develop those over my adult life. And I would have been a terrible teacher had I been working with kids who were from poverty, or kids who were from different ethnicities than myself. But I was working with white middle-class kids who were a lot like me. And because I was really good at other things, more of the technical side of instruction, my students did well. Mm-hmm. But today we're asking teachers to often work in classrooms where there's, 2, 3, 5, 10 different languages spoken. And that's an amazing ask, for someone to be able to handle that, as well as to be empathic when things occur in their classroom that normally they would feel like they would just like snap back and respond to a student. Because now if you're really culturally aware and culturally proficient, your first thought might be, whoa, what has that kid been through that I didn't know about?
Right.
And that's a different response.
Yeah. All right. And so as we're reshaping schools, in your book, you talk about, you use the acronym SHARE, both for schools level and classroom level. And one of those you mentioned was hope. Can you just briefly go over like what the SHARE at the school level was look like? And then we'll get into the classroom level, because a lot of the listeners here are classroom teachers.
Yes. I think a blunt way to talk about hope for populations of students of any age and any socioeconomic status is that if you take away hope, the game is over. So many middle-class kids feel hopeful because they see other kids around them having some levels of success, like they play on a team, they're in an academic class where they can succeed, they perceive the possibility of colleges. And if you're an upper class kid, you see a lot of financial success in your family or community. So for those types of students, building hope is less important. For students who grow up in families where hopelessness might be more common, or in families where there's enormous adversity, or daily rituals of how do we stretch the dollar, or they don't see anyone around them who is succeeding, hope is absolutely game-changing critical. In other words, if you want somebody to succeed, you have to give them a clear why it's possible. Like, it's possible because here are others like you who have made it in the world. Mm-hmm. It's possible because we value you just because you're you, not because of what you have done in the past or because of the money your parents have. We value you as being you. And if kids don't feel like school is for them, meaning it doesn't value them, it doesn't, like, that's why it's such a big deal for, as an example, African-American males to have at least one African-American adult at the school that they can go, whoa, actually, there might be a place for me in this world. Because if the only African-American males they see are in their neighborhood, or the only ones they see are in low-paying jobs, then they start to wonder. If I'm a classroom teacher and my students in my class were, let's say, Latinos, African Americans, you can bet your bottom dollar that I am going to have up on the wall posters of successful African Americans. And I'm not just talking sports. It's going to be in education and arts. I'm going to show kids in my class the Supreme Court justices who are African American, who are Latino. I'm going to show them astronauts who are Latino, African American. I'm going to show people in Congress who are that way. The point is that either you see the possibility of a better future or you don't. And it usually comes from relationships and all of the side things like the posters, the reading materials that have to be culturally relevant and speak truths to kids. All of those have to be present. Like, it's not an easy process for a school to do this, but if you want kids to succeed, it's the only way to go.
So that just underscores the value and the importance of libraries making sure their collections are culturally relevant, and the reading assignments in language arts classes and things like that.
Absolutely. And the teacher has to be aware enough to be able to identify and get excited about and share those things, not just have them be in a spot on the campus that kids can go to and find, and maybe the librarian, media specialist will help them. But the teacher's got to be passionate about it too.
And so, continuing on the subject of teachers in the classroom, you talk about the share factors for classroom level success. S would stand for standards-based curriculum instruction. We talked about the H, which is hope building. A is for arts, athletics, and advanced placement. R is for retooling of the operating system, and E is engaging instruction. And like you said, that's a big ask for teachers. But I think you also mentioned, you gave us hope in this book by saying that the way to do it is to look at data and make micro adjustments.
Yes, absolutely. Schools that try to do everything at once, it's pretty rare that those schools work. But if you create a culture at your school which says, listen, we want our students to grow and change, we have to do this too. And when I put on professional development for teachers, most every change I ask for are changes that take between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. And there's many reasons for that. One of them is they're more likely to get implemented. Mm-hmm. But another reason for that is simply that we want students to be able to feel like their teacher is on the same page as them, that they're growing, that they're changing, and that they're willing to do things that are different. That's a big ask, as we've said before, but that's what I want students and teachers to be after, is micro changes that over the long haul, heck, 1% per day becomes a huge gain over a year's time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so at the end of your book, you have a section on the lights and magic and a Mr. Hawkins. And I thought that gave concrete steps on things that teachers can do on a daily basis to provide that classroom atmosphere that's data driven, that's hope infused, that kind of thing. One thing I noticed that's so different from the way that I was taught how to teach is that it's very active for the students. Right. So there's music playing when they come in, and they're up out of their seats, every 20 minutes or so?
Yes. Yes. And I think part of this comes from my background in the neurosciences, where when you want brains to make changes, first, the context is everything, meaning, is the environment safe? Can I take a risk? Is my teacher an ally, not an adversary? So first you're creating that context. The second thing, if you want brains to change, is you have to give them what you and I might call sort of a positive perturbation. And this perturbation is sort of what some teachers would call a hook in a classroom, like get kids curious. Mm-hmm. Unless the brain goes into that state called, I'm hungry, I want to learn this, here's why I want to learn that, your likelihood of getting them to take on skills, content, behaviors, all of those is pretty low. And the way you create that perturbation is to stimulate in the brain the areas that are involved with, oh, this is behaviorally relevant to me. I want to do this now. So for some kids, behavioral relevance means that you say to them, this is going to help you get into the college that you want. For other kids, they're younger, it might be, this is going to make your mom so happy that you'll do really, really well this year in school. Behavioral relevance is always the big why. So a culturally responsive classroom is a classroom where kids move their bodies a lot, because moving increases circulation for the body. we also know with the newer research today that every part of your brain that's involved with movement is also totally involved with cognition. We used to think your brain was separate, like the cerebellum was for movement and the frontal lobes were for thinking. Now we know that's baloney, that the cerebellum is very involved with processing and thinking, and even there's some memory that it stores. Like, it's crazy how integrated our brain is. So that's why having kids get up, move around, interact, socialize, hear music. I'm not saying turn your class into, a pop festival. I'm saying you have to know what you're going to do in the classroom. So I do that when I do a training for adults. I spend the first 3 to 5 minutes prepping their brain for what I'm going to do that day and prepping their body. I'll ask them to stand up. I'll say, when music begins, touch any 5 tables in the room except your own table. When you get to the 5th table, just wait for further directions. Already I get them up, moving, upbeat music. I'm doing this with adults. The point I'm making about this is that you have to say to yourself, what do I know about how brains actually, what do they need in order to feel safe? What do they need in order to learn? What do they need? And you have to go from that point of view. All of the things like the curriculum that you're using, what everyone tells you should teach, all of those won't work unless the human side says, how do we sequence this just right for the brain so that the kids are ready? And there's a bit of science to that and a bit of background that it requires as well as the intentionality for it.
So that's a good thing to do at the beginning. Can you give us some pointers on how to close a class effectively?
Well, I think I'm going to, right before we get to the close, I'm going to say the middle part of your class can happen many different ways, just because there's many different ways to learn. For example, some learning can be a layered learning where you start with background information and you start with what you already know, and you're starting with introducing vocabulary, and you just kind of go layer by layer by layer, almost like sheets of paper in a big stack. You can also go about that through immersion, like kind of get dunked into the whole thing, as in when you're doing language learning, you learn it faster if you can do that in the culture of another country almost. Or you could do your class that is more like skill building sets of deliberate practice. In other words, I'm not pushing one way of teaching just for the middle part. But for the closing part, the core understanding about how our brains works is that there's got to be error correction as part of the closing. So kids are going to be doing some practice with a partner or practice out loud, or could be with technology. They've got to do things that correct errors, because you'd rather have them go home and let their brains sleep on the correct information than the incorrect one. So there's an error correction. You also would like to have there be a break meaning time if you're at the K-5 level, a space of time before you start up something new, whether that's just a quiet time, whether that's physical activity without cognitive activity that is embedded within that, but you need a little bit of a brain break. At the secondary level, there's obviously the passing time between classes. The bottom line is a little bit of a brain break is good, because that allows for processing time. Then you're going to go after that retrieval time the next day and the next day. So I always want to close the class on an emotional high. The reason for that is I want their brain to remember how good it felt to learn something. In other words, kids like or don't like school usually because of emotional moments. The grades are less important than, did my teacher give me the evil eye, or did I do poorly on a test? It's really the aggregate over a long period of time where they had enough positive emotional hits so that the kids say, I like school. It's been good.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember reading somewhere years ago that true learning happens when your emotions are involved.
Well, the overlap between emotions and cognition has been studied to some degree. And one of the leading neuroscientists who studies emotions, Antonio Damasio, who's professor emeritus at USC. And he has written many books on it for the layperson. One of them was called Descartes' Error. And Descartes was most famous for the phrase that talked a little bit about emotion and cognition. And I bring this up because Damasio says that it's about an 80% overlap between cognition and emotion. And 80% means that about 80% of what you process cognitively also has emotional content in it. And about 80% of your emotions have a cognitive content to them. Like, for example, if you said to another person, hey, what do you want to do for lunch today? And someone says, I don't know, I feel like Chinese food today. Notice how you just blended a cognitive thought and an emotion. So you accessed what kind of restaurant or what type of food, and then you added the feeling to it. I feel like Chinese food. So that's just an example of a shortcut that we would use every day. Damasio says there's about 10 or 20% that is raw emotions, no cognition, and raw cognition, no emotions. So I would be careful about saying that it always has to have that. I'll just say that if I'm the teacher, I'm going to embed emotion in it because it helps with memory and it helps with good feelings about school. And those are pretty priceless, aren't they?
Absolutely. For sure. So one last question before I let you go here. And that is, well, I guess I have two more questions. First of all, how can we, as schools or as teachers, include the families?
Well, first of all, there are schools that have high poverty populations that do pretty well as an above average for a Title I school without a lot of family participation. And I'd say they're the exception. The ones that are very successful with bringing in kids with their parents or parents separately are schools that are highly intentional about it and schools that are very operationally open-minded, meaning when should we do this? What times of the day? How do we do invitations for parents? What's the context for it? So the short answer about this is that if you build it, they will come. If you make it worth being there, they will come. So one secondary principal told me that he had not had much success getting parents to come, but he and his staff came up with an idea called Parent University. And the Parent University simply was a series of 8 classes where the staff at the school worked together and different teachers volunteered to work with a teaching partner to do one of the 8 classes. So there was no teacher that was unduly burdened by this, and they all chose to do this. For example, one of the 8 classes for Parent University could have been how to help my child succeed at homework. Mm-hmm. And so this would be a 55-minute class, and parents would come to that at the school once a week. And of course, the school would offer munchies and childcare if it was necessary, that kind of thing. But what the principal told me is when he first offered this program, notice how each of the programs would have a nice hook in the title, like how to help your child do better at homework. Like it sounds like a pretty, decent hook. The truth is that most of this was growth that they wanted the parents to make. Like an example, how do you help your child behave better at home? Well, most of this was about how do you help the parent behave better to help the child behave better. But the hook was strong enough for parents to want to be there. And they did this on 8 different topics for parents. The principal at the beginning had no idea if this would work, but he had told me that the first year he had something like 75 or 80 parents sign up for it. And over the course of the semester, as they started going to classes, they loved this so much that for the first time, the principal saw that he had a real way to connect parents, which was they had to have the big three. Anytime you put on something for parents, it's got to have the big three. The first thing, it's got to provide resources that the parents don't have easy access to. And that could be along the lines of you can provide for them food, it could be healthcare, it could be dentistry, it could be programs like at Parent University, but it's got to provide resources. Like a second thing is it's got to create connectivity. Like who can you link up with them? Sometimes they need to be linked up with counselors, social services, sometimes financial people. So more connections and support are always a good idea. And the third thing is usually about building the skill sets within the parents so that they can be a more amazing parent. I mean, most parents love their kids, but it doesn't make them automatically a great parent. So the Parent University provided all of those, and it provided the connection with the school in a very emotional way, because every time the parents came to the Parent University, they felt like, wow, I love learning all this stuff. So as the program was starting to end, the principal realized that, whoa, this is a bigger deal than I thought. I think we're going to need to maybe do something special. So he and his team set up a graduation ceremony for all the parents. So the parents and the kids came to the auditorium on the last, I guess it was the last evening of the last class. They set that up. I'm trying to remember how they orchestrated it. But the principal had also gone into town and found one of those companies that normally at a high school graduation would rent out gowns. And he got robes for every single parent to wear a graduation robe. He also printed out certificates for every single parent in the program with their name on it. It was signed by the principal. And each parent at the ceremony was asked to come up on stage one at a time. And the whole audience would just go nuts with applause and everything. And what the principal told me, he said, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. And he said he realized why. He said most of his parents had never, ever graduated from high school. And because of this, what the school did that no one else had done was to create an emotional link with the value of learning, which translated not just cognitively into all the classes that the parents attended, but now the parents had the feeling in their body and in their brain about why an education is valuable. They had that feeling. So it changed how they started treating school texts, announcements, meetings for this. Like if there's a holiday party or a Thanksgiving that held at the school, it's like it changed everything for the parents. They went, wow, this is what they do, and it feels good. So there's really, you can find whole books on all the things that schools can do, but I like things that create strong emotions, provide strong skill sets, provide contacts for parents. And when you get that trifecta, then you've literally altered the lives of the parents. Because some schools, they think if they just throw food out, parents will come. Well, usually, but hey, almost anybody will show up for free food anywhere. The point I make about it is, how do you move people forward? And for parents, this can move them forward. For example, one of the classes that they taught was about regulating stress. Chronic stressors is a huge issue for people who grow up in poverty. And you've got three types of stress. You've got a healthy stress that most of us experience on a daily basis. It's kind of a bell-shaped curve where the stress goes up and then it goes away. Then you've got a traumatic acute stressor, like from an event that occurred, like there was a murder down the street or whatever. Or you've got the chronic stress, which is day after day after day after day after day. It never goes away, sort of stuff. So helping the parents deal with these stressors in their home is life-saving for them. And it's life-saving because Chronic and acute stressors increases inflammation in the body, and that weakens the immune system, which can lead to kids getting sick, parents getting sick, susceptibility to diseases, and fatigue. And so you start getting this incredible connectivity that when you start helping parents be better at dealing with acute and chronic stressors, then they're healthier, and then they have more energy, and they're less fatigued, and they have a greater feeling of control over their lives, which in turn starts to reduce their stress, which allows them to learn more, which allows them to change their behaviors. In other words, part of what we're up against when you go after working successfully with families from poverty is that you start seeing that nearly every piece of the puzzle connects from every other piece of the puzzle. And just learning how to support parents and kids and teachers in the issue of stress is important, because chronic stress inhibits behavior change. So when you have parents at home that are experiencing chronic stress, they don't change. They do the same old, same old, same old. But guess what? Everybody's like that. So when you have staff at school that feel chronically stressed, and for some teachers, this starts somewhere around the holidays and it continues through the end of the school year. When you have that, a day of professional development between December and May is pretty much a waste of time unless the whole day is about self-care. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
And so we can't run schools with kids who show up stressed, who are coming from homes where the parents are probably really stressed, who experience teachers who are stressed. And that's like throwing gasoline on a fire. And then people wonder why there's, suspensions, like 3 to 5 times more suspensions of kids from poverty than there are kids who are middle class. Why? Because you have stressed kids with stressed teachers, and you keep lighting a match every day. And your teachers don't know how to deal with that. And on top of that, if they did know how to deal with it, they're too stressed to do it well.
Yeah. Well, and the whole topic of self-care is one that I'm increasingly passionate about, and probably could be an episode in and of itself.
Absolutely. And it's worth you doing about 5 episodes.
I'll make a list. We'll start that.
Yeah. But I think this is something that's like it's universal among those who are working at Title I schools, and that is that the staff that are better at self-regulation, and that means the staff that can help and foster moderate to manageable levels of stress in themselves, are better at teaching students. In addition, the staff that are more empathic are better at working with, understanding, and developing relationships with kids. In addition, the staff that understand the power of forgiveness, which is critical. Otherwise, you get teachers who the first 2 weeks of school, a kid does something in class, that teacher gets ticked off, and they hold a grudge against the kid the whole semester or the whole year. How is that a good thing? And it's not, obviously. So helping teachers develop a rock solid core of self-care would be a starting place for a successful school. And most schools only recently did they even have a conversation about that. You can't keep throwing teachers out into environments which for some teachers are pretty hostile.
Well, and perhaps this is something that needs to be started in those pre-service programs that we were talking about at the beginning.
Well, it does. I can tell you that as a no-brainer, yes. But I'll also say the biggest issues I've had in professional development doing self-care strategies and mindset with teachers is that many schools will commonly do these in July, August, or September, and maybe October. And these are during the times of the year when most teachers are feeling pretty good. So these mindsets and strategies often, but not always, get dismissed. even when I show them grueling, like almost rip your heart out data that shows if you don't do this, here's your health risks, Mm-hmm. But they blow it away because that's like, somebody saying, well, the fire's not at my house. It's like 10 miles away.
Right.
And so people don't feel compelled to work on something until their house is burning down. Then they run like crazy and say, I hardly had time to grab any of my belongings. And I'm thinking,
until it's a crisis.
Well, I tried,
Right. Yeah.
And I think this just brings us back to, Matt, this notion about when you're working with students who grow up in poverty, I wish you could take on only one small thing. But what I would say is take on one small thing in your own personal life. Take on one small thing, maybe in the social systems in your school, like in teamwork or support or parenting interactions, and maybe one small micro change in instruction. Really small things in different domains give you a synergistic effect, as opposed to one small thing in a domain that is going to interact with other domains, but you just say, well, that's all I can do is one small thing. The problem is schools aren't actually divided into things like system change, social change, and personal change. I just gave those labels, even though they're just fictional domains. In my mind, they exist, but the point I'm making is every person who's listening who says, I could change something for 30 seconds, I'd say, great. Here's what I'd like you to do. The next time you feel your shoulders tensing up and you feel stressed about a student in your class, every time you feel stressed, that's your cue to pause, take a deep breath, relax, and say to yourself, I can do this. The person I'm working with may have gone through something I can't even imagine. I'm going to lower my voice. I'm going to assure them that I'm their ally and I'm on their side. I'm going to make sure that the identity that I use with them is the identity I want, meaning I'm going to say, I love how you stand up for yourself. That's important to do. If you don't do that in life, life's going to be hard. Or, I love your leadership skills. But if you want to be a leader and stay in school, I'll show you how to do that. You and I need to talk after class. So I'm going to de-escalate those things because I know deep down that many kids are acting out because of chronic or acute stressors from home. And if I can de-escalate those by having better stress regulation in myself, and then I can follow this up with a conversation with the kid about how the kid can get what they want by behaving differently, and then me coaching them along. Pretty soon, one by one, my class starts getting better and better and better, and change starts happening, and teachers go, wow, my class is way better than it was a month ago. But I'm literally saying this is a 30-second behavior change. You notice the trigger, you give the behavior, and you reward yourself later on by saying, I did it. I can do this.
Yeah, that's so powerful. Well, Eric, everything you do is really powerful. And I feel like we could talk probably for another couple hours, but I know you have things to do. You're here in the, at least in my time zone, I think for a short time. So thank you so much for joining me today with this conversation. How can people find out more about you?
You can just Google my name, Eric Jensen, and you'll find me at jensenlearning.com. And I'm doing 4 different courses this year, this 19 through 20 school year, 4 different courses called Teaching and Engaging with Poverty in Mind. The 4 courses will be held 2 in June and 2 in July. You'd only take 1 if you wanted to. They're 3-day courses. And those are the last ones I'll be doing ever because I'm retiring. So if you want to catch me this coming summer. And so just check us out at jensenlearning.com. I'd be delighted to hear from you. You can also subscribe to my free newsletter, which would be a great resource for you. So I appreciate so much, Matt, you having me. It's been a pleasure. And the best of you who are listening to this podcast, we hope to be back in front of your ears again at some point in the future.
Well, once again, thank you, Eric, for sharing your expertise today. And thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in.
For this episode's show notes, past episodes, or how you can earn professional development hours for listening, visit teachillinois.com, your online portal for teacher learning. Thanks for listening.